Hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Wednesday Night Live. I welcome the cyberspace audience as well. And the title, which I don't know if it intrigues any of you, but it intrigued me, so that's why I'm here. Are you lonely? I know once I gave a talk over a weekend over Shabbaton here in Manhattan many years ago, and the topic was existential loneliness. After I finished the talk, a woman came over to me, someone I knew, an esteemed woman. She said to me, every time you mention existential loneliness, you made me cry. So if you don't mind, next time you speak, don't mention it so often. But nevertheless, I like to choose topics that are perhaps not addressed often enough or at all, precisely because they're uncomfortable, because they're the things that we carry inside of us without really ever speaking about it. And some of the most important elements in life that are going on beneath the surface inside our hearts, inside our psyches, inside of our unconscious, are the most important issues to address, because that's the root of most of our problems and challenges and difficulties. As I often discuss almost every week, actually, that who we are right now, who you are sitting here in this chair, and who you think you are, is usually not a good description of who you really are. Because long before our conscious memories, when we were little children, those formative years, from the moment of birth till approximately 3-4 years old, we don't have many memories of. Most people's memories go back, first memories, which are just little fragments, is usually around 3 years old, 3-4. Unless some trauma, God forbid, or some extenuating circumstances. But even then, even if we have some memories, they're usually, as I said, fragmented. They're very isolated, as opposed to a flowing story. And as we all know, when you look at children, much is happening in a child's life in those early years that, no question, shapes us. If you look at books and child psychology of, let's say, 50, 60 years ago, and I did this, you'll be shocked to find, just 50 years ago, the perspective on children is very different than it is today. Children were perceived by the majority of experts as being deaf, dumb, and mute. Not physically, but psychologically. And a child was like just basically like a clean slate. And as the child developed into an adult, that's when things started to change and affect the personality of a child. But at a young age, children were seen as such. If you look at some of the writings of, let's say, the Quakers and some others, they actually see children as being, they sometimes call them cruel beasts that have to be beaten to submission. These were some of the theories that prevailed in even academic circles. Today, things have changed, and most psychologists, secular or otherwise, will say that the most impactful years are the early formative years. And some will say that by the age 7 or 8, we've already been shaped. And almost everything after that is just history. It just has to take time to blossom one way or the other. Now, of course, this makes much more sense to us, but just for contrast purposes and not to pull rank, since we've been around, when I say we, the Jewish people, the Torah has been around. The Torah has plenty to say about child psychology. As a matter of fact, the entire Torah is centered around a child, because it knows that everything is shaped. So not 40 years ago, not 50 years ago, from the beginning, going back thousands of years, Jewish tradition, Jewish beliefs, Jewish mysticism, Jewish philosophy, starting from the Torah itself, all talks about a child being like a warm ball of wax. And a warm ball of wax is very pliable, very impressionable, and as the experiences begin to be embedded in this wax, as the wax hardens as we get older, just like our arteries harden, just like as our personalities harden, just like our habits and routines harden, so too do those experiences harden in this wax. And once they harden, they become part of our personalities, to the point that you can't even distinguish often between nurture and nature. What we're born with and what shaped us in our early formative years. Which is why in Judaism the Torah makes such a focus that the center of all attention is all around children. Because children are adults. You and I are all children. Today we use words like inner child, which became very popular in the 70s. James Bradshaw, John Bradshaw rather, and others, psychologists and other healers, the inner child. And one way or other, it's become a very resonating term that many of us are trying to finding some happiness is really finding what that child inside of us really wants. Because that child once was deprived, or abandoned, or worse, hurt. And then we live out our adult lives trying to compensate for that, and we don't even know it. This is very fundamental today. Not everyone agrees exactly with all the same idea, perfect principles, but the general idea, which makes total sense, is that long before we had control, it was our parents and our environments that shaped us. And those have deep impact on us. How we learn how to love. Where did we learn how to love? We learned love from what we saw in our homes. So if our parents did not know how to love each other, so tragically that became our model. And that became a model that we consider to be, that is the model. So it means a dysfunctional love becomes our almost aspiration, as bizarre as it sounds. And if it's a healthy love, obviously that impacts us. And as we know, children, everything is amplified. Nothing is just, someone scratches you right now when you're 20, 30 years old, 40 years old, doesn't mean much. But when you scratch a seed or a warm piece of wax, it means a lot, because when that seed develops into a tree, when that child matures into an adult, that little scratch is now a major, I want to use the word, major scar or wound, right? And this is why it's so difficult for us to often find solutions to our main problems, especially around relationships, especially around areas that are emotional and personal. We may be very efficient people and very functional in business, in other types of interactions, but when it comes to the personal, that's where the real you plays itself out. How you interact in relationships. That's where security and insecurity comes into play. Our fears, our inhibitions, and all those elements, the things that are mostly unspoken. And in many ways, you can even identify it, especially our sexual identities, which is the thing least spoken about and most mysterious to all of us. Is the area that is most complicated, because first of all, we're not aware of how even to identify that identity, and when it develops, at what age, and it becomes a force in our lives that remains like that type of expression. You can't live with it, you can't live without it. So it becomes everybody needs sexuality, everybody has a need for intimacy, or however one defines sexuality, but often it becomes extremely elusive, fraught with kinds of mixed feelings, and obviously vulnerabilities, because the deeper you go into your psyche, the deeper you go into your heart and soul, the more vulnerable and the more fragile it is. So when you're a person who's developed that part of yourself in a healthy environment, in a nurturing environment, obviously it's far easier to access, far easier to function with that. But if it was underdeveloped, or our own sense of self, our own sense of our own sexual identities, our own sense of confidence, and our own sense of self-esteem has been somewhat thwarted or somewhat distorted, then it plays itself out in relationships more than anything. We test people. Trust is a big issue. We usually don't say what we're really feeling, and it becomes a whole complicated game. Each of us knows the complexities of our armor, the defense mechanisms that we develop. And the more creative a person is, and the more hurt they've been, obviously their mechanisms are far more complicated and complex, to the point that it becomes very difficult to really distinguish who's in control. Now I know some of what I'm saying may resonate with some of you, may not resonate. Hopefully it doesn't resonate. That would be a sign of very strong, healthy people here. But you may meet some people that these ideas resonate with, because we all in some way or others are wounded. And I'm not trying to paint a negative picture and suggesting that we're all beyond hope. God forbid. That's the last thing I want to say, because the whole principle that I want to really lead to is that there's no such thing as damaged goods. There is perhaps deprivation Like, a person who, let's say, was deprived of oxygen or food. So it could be that we're trying to compensate in all kinds of ways, healthy or unhealthy, but that doesn't mean there's no solution. Obviously, we're here to talk about solutions. You didn't come for me to tell you the picture of the problems. Everybody can paint their own picture of problems. I'm here to try to suggest that there's ways to get beyond it. But, as we always talk about, the Hebrew expression that Yediyat Hamach Lechetzi Refuah, half the cure is awareness. The awareness of a problem is half its cure. When I say awareness of a problem, I don't mean awareness only of the symptoms. Awareness of what the real problem is. And often we carry all kinds of stuff in our, we don't even know what the real root of the problem is. We can identify how it's playing itself out in our lives, that this is not working, that's not working, and so on. But the true search is for what exactly is the issue. And the issue is usually not a symptom. It's usually a root problem. And in most cases, something we're most likely not so aware of. Because if we were aware of it, it would already be easier to deal with. Infections that you're aware of, and they're not fester, so you see an infection, you address it. The problem is with the infections that are beyond our scope of vision or perception. That's where it gets more complicated. Where our blind spots, our subjectivity, our pride, our habits get in the way and don't allow us to see it all. So discussing the topic of loneliness goes in that category, because very few people are just going to get up and say, I'm a lonely person. It doesn't feel good to say something like that. Maybe in a 12-step program people will say that, where they're open and honest. But it doesn't sound very sexy to say, I'm lonely. And a lot of people won't say it simply because, just like they have this stereotype that men don't cry, for example. Or whatever it is, that we have to put up a tough veneer, which frankly is also part of the problem, because often children who are hurt and they want to cry are told you're not allowed to cry, or they're not given permission to cry, because that's not what a person does. Which of course also you're making us uncomfortable if you cry, because then there's a problem. Now, I can't tell you how many adults have told me that they were literally not allowed to express themselves. I remember someone came to see me a number of years ago. I've told this story, I believe, once at a Passover workshop. I was talking about the salt water that we use at a Passover, which is symbolic of tears. So I shared the story. This fellow came to see me, and as soon as he walked into my office, I realized there's serious problems here. I just saw his whole body was all wound up. Without even opening his mouth, I saw that there's a lot of knots inside of this man's soul and body. Anyway, he began to speak. He was a man in his 40s, and he began to speak. As soon as he began to speak, I saw that also he spoke like an infant, basically. He was infantilized. And he told me he's a person who was always taken advantage of, was laughed at, both at home, at school. Basically, zero self-esteem. And how he got to me, someone suggested he come to speak to me, but I saw that he had tried many therapies, and he was basically at the end of his line, in his words. He was barely able to really communicate well, because he had all these hang-ups. So even his communication was he was basically self-defeating, and he became the realized prophecy, what everybody told him, that he's a loser. So he behaved as one even while he was sitting with me. And really, my heart went out to him. And I had no clue really what to say to him. Didn't have any advice, because I saw that his whole life was just one big mess. I didn't even know where to begin. You begin at a personal level. He didn't have any relationships. He had no friends. I don't even know how he survived. But I'm a big believer in divine providence. He came to me. Maybe I could do something. I didn't know what. So I just continued. I was being nice, just trying to hear him out, to just maybe pick up a clue, something I could perhaps identify with, something I may be able to share. But it was one of those situations I couldn't really even empathize, I couldn't identify. I empathize, I was able to, but I couldn't really put my finger on anything that seemingly can give him some suggestion. As I told you, he's so self-defeating. Everything he did was basically self-destructive. And it was now years. He wasn't a 20-year-old any longer. It was this became his routine, his habit. He's isolated, lives alone, etc. Anyway, I just had this instinct. So I asked him to stand up. And I stood up. He was sitting on the chair. I was sitting. And I said to him, "Do you mind if I hug you?" In a very innocent way. And he was shocked, because I saw no one had ever hugged this man. Not as a child, not as an adult. So I went over and I hugged him. And he recoiled into literally, it felt like I was hugging a spring. It was so tight. It was unbelievable. And literally almost like a pillar of stone. And he was just standing there. He had no clue, And he wasn't intimidated or frightened. The whole thing to him was an oddity. And I just saw that a man, like his soul and his heart and his emotions, completely trapped inside of him. And he didn't even know how to react to this. It was like completely, as I said, embraced, like you give give someone a hug when you meet them. So then I asked him, instinctively I said to him, did you ever cry? Because what you describe is a very sad story, making me cry. Do you ever cry? He says, no, I don't cry. He almost like didn't know what tears were. And I said to him, are you ever sad? Do you feel sad about life? So he said, long ago his father told him that babies cry. And that if he cries again, he'll be slapped and punished. So I imagine, just hearing that, I really realized how bad it was. And I didn't even need to know more details. Because once someone's told that by a parent, a child, you're not supposed to cry, ever. So I realized it was really serious dysfunctionality. My goal then was basically to make him cry. That was really about it. That became my focus. And I got him to cry. And that time, I don't mean that in a sadistic way to get him to cry. Just simply to express, because tears are, as some of the Kabbalists say, tears they bathe the soul. When you have a bath, when you go underwater, when you somewhat go to cleanse yourself, there's something soothing about being bathed, by being submerged in water. So they say that tears is a form of being submerged. When a person cries, and we're talking about healthy tears, it's a form of cleansing, it's a form of release, which itself is a healing agent, which may be not surprising why it's salt water. Salt is a cleanser. So salt water. And it's a salty tears. And in that sense, in Hebrew, dima means tears. It's a cleanser in that. Think of it this way. Think of it like a kettle, a boiling kettle of water. So the kettle boils. And imagine there would be no spout. What would happen? Once it starts boiling, and there's nowhere to go, it's going to explode. This is the equivalent of someone who doesn't ever cry. Or, for that matter, really express themselves. When things bother you, there's no release, there's no spout. So the pressures build up. Where do they go? They have no outer expression, whether it's a cry, whether it's a sigh, whether it's oiveo, whether it's even just communication with someone. What happens is it goes inward. So we don't explode. What happens is it implodes. What happens is layers begin to build up inside of you of tension, anxiety. There's nowhere to go with it. There's a very fascinating, a very deep psychological insight in the Talmud, as explained by one of the Hasidic masters. There's a verse in the Torah that says the following: Im yidag adam, if a person is anxious, or daiga, concerned, troubled, but anxious, I think, is the best word. Im yidag adam, if a person is anxious, yasiach. That's the word, yasiach. So the Talmud asks the question, what does yasiach mean? There's two interpretations. The word yasiach can be read as yasiach with a samach. If you know Hebrew, it means hesachadat, which means to distract yourself. Yasiach, distract yourself. If a person is anxious, find a way to distract yourself, so you shouldn't be focusing on the cause of your anxiety. And there's a second interpretation with you write yasiach with a sin, not with a samach, with a sin, and that comes from the word sichat, speak about it. Break your silence and communicate, express it. Two solutions at the Talmud, two different opinions. So one of the Hasidic masters, his name was Reb Shmuel of Chabad, Rebbe Marash was his name. He asked the question, he said, seemingly there's a contradiction. To speak about something, it's not just two diverse opinions, they're contradictory. To speak about something is the exact opposite of distracting yourself, because when you speak about it, you're dwelling on it, and you're focusing on it. And to distract yourself means to move away from it and not dwell. And his answer is a fascinating answer. It's really the essence of therapy, healthy therapy, I should add. And really a principle, a fundamental principle in Judaism. Long before the word therapy, Judaism called it soul healing. A rabbi was meant to be a soul doctor, not an administrator and a fundraiser, but a soul doctor. And what is soul healing about? And the way he explains it is that by speaking about it, that's how you distract yourself from it. In other words, you release it. It's not speaking to dwell and indulge yourself to just talk, which some people do as well. But it's really speaking about it, like instead of carrying it inside of you, allowing, like the spout I mentioned, was to express. And the way you release it, you give it away. I remember years ago, I was after my book was published, Torah Meaning for Life, I was in South Africa, in Johannesburg, for a book tour. And after one of my lectures, it was an appointment we had, a meeting we had with the chairman of Nissan Motors, of all of South Africa. So he was an Afrikaans guy, like one of these equivalent America, big, almost like muscular football type of CEO, like what do we call him here? We'd call him would be the equivalent of it. I don't know. But anyway, and he was and he was like he was intimidated everyone around him, and he wanted to meet with me. So the fellow introduced me, and then he asked him to step out, and we sat alone with me and this chairman. And he said to me, "I want to share with you something very personal." And he said, "I last year lost my son to an aneurysm." And he began to cry. He said to me, he was my only boy. He was 19 years old, and he died in my arms. He was a golden soul. That's the way he put it. He said he had a beautiful golden soul. And I'm this chairman. Everybody respects me. I have a big position. I'm one of the most prominent businessmen here. My life was devastated. Devastated. For months I couldn't go to work. Because suddenly I realized, what's really important. I can make all this money. You could be a businessman and all that. But my son, he died in my hand. I had no control over it. And I was really completely upset and disturbed my entire life. When I finally came back to work, like 3-4 months later, he said, I was being briefed. I was being briefed by my team. And there was accountants there, a few different people. They brought me some documents, and one person gave me a bunch of spreadsheets. And he happened to be a Jewish accountant in the firm. And after he gave me the spreadsheets, he said, under the spreadsheets, he also slipped me a book. He said to me, "I know it's not protocol for me to give you a book, but I think after what you've gone through, I'm taking the nerve, to give you this book. And I suggest you read it." And I left it open to the chapter on death. It was the book, what's Torah Meaning for Life? Yeah, why not? A battery. Right. And he said to me, I read the book, especially that chapter. He began to cry again, I remember. And he embraced me. He said to me, I have to tell you, what this book taught me, especially that chapter, it taught me, these are his words. I'm trying to remember the exact words because they were very poignant. And at the moment, he said, it taught me to give my pain to God and get strength in return. Those were his words. He says, I'm not a religious man, but that's what it taught me to do. And I've built a lot of strength. Not like I've lost the pain, but I've found something to replace it with. And it was just an interesting way that he expressed it. He thanked me, and that was really the meeting about. I just wanted to thank me. But I'm obviously quite moved and humbled. And I remember just, when you hear it from a person who went through the real thing, this wasn't just a cliche, a line. It was coming from the gut, from his inner kishkas, his guts. So I realized that idea of being able to not avoid the pain or deny it, but actually to be able to give it away, is a powerful concept, which is perhaps why in therapy and most healing, one of the first and most important things is breaking the silence. Because the silence itself, as they say, to use a strong expression, they say the silence is worse than the rape. Because when a person suffers in some way, or in some way is traumatized, or violated, or abused, so obviously that's horrendous. But then if they're not allowed to cry, and they're told nothing happened, or they're told, it's your fault, or they're told you can't, all the different blocks, then that is even worse crime. The cover-up is always worse, because you can't even heal. That's like an infection that's not open to fresh air, so it begins to fester and build and build and build, and by the time you have to deal with it, become a monster. And it's almost impossible to just control. So that idea of yasiach, to express it and release it, or like tears, that release, are itself a very powerful force, because it gives you above all, not just a release point, but also gives you the dignity that you're entitled to cry, the dignity that you have a right to express yourself. You have a right to say, this is not right. You have a right to say, something's wrong, and you have a right to say, I want to fix it. Without that, you then start deceiving yourself, or being deceived into thinking that there's no problem. It begins invalidating who you are, what happened to you, to the point where you start wondering, maybe my reactions, my instincts are wrong. One of the first things, most aggressive, one of the worst things you hear about people who really suffered is they have no bearings. They don't know what's right and wrong. They don't even know if they can trust themselves. They'll say, I don't know if I can trust my feelings because I was told those feelings weren't right. So basically what's happening in using the language of Kabbalah or Hasidus is the dignity of an individual, which is the birthright of every one of us, the birth-given right that each of us has, that our soul is precious and indispensable and divine and indestructible, has been challenged, has been questioned. And once that's in question, you don't even have then the confidence to fight the battle. We all have our battles, but when you have the confidence, you know that you can fight a battle, it's a whole different story. So it brings me back to this whole issue of loneliness. I remember years ago, I was doing a radio show here in New York for a while. 3 years. I don't know if any of you remember. Some of you may remember. It's called Toward a Meaningful Life, a show for skeptics and seekers. It was a live radio show, 6 to 7 p.m. on Sundays. It was on WEVD, which is today 1050 on the AM dial in New York. Today it's ESPN. So, I don't know if it's a success of my show that led it to become ESPN, or the other way around. But then ESPN, and that's when we stopped the show because I wasn't going to do sports radio. So. Sports talk. But one of the shows was on loneliness. And actually I did it from a studio of a man that has in some ways, I guess I can't say glorified it, but in some ways has made it popular in a way. Named Leonard Cohen. So Leonard Cohen became friendly with me. We're friends from a while back. I wrote an article about something, a whole topic. It's a whole story of its own, but he wrote me a whole commentary and we became friends. So I was in LA that weekend, and Sunday we met. I met in his house. He has a studio in Los Angeles. So I told him at 6 o'clock New York time, which was 3 o'clock LA time, that I needed to do the show. So he said, fine, you'll do it from my studio. And I told him, the topic is loneliness. And that was not because I was there. It happened to be the topic because it was the day before Tisha B'Av, the saddest day of the Jewish calendar. So it's a lonely day. It's a day that talks about loneliness. So I said, maybe you'd like to come on the show. And he didn't come on because of all too many legal matters that he'd have to get permissions from this, from that. So bottom line says, but I'll give you a poem that no one has ever seen, and you can read it. It's my gift to you. Read it on the show. Say it's an original poem from Leonard Cohen, never before publicized, which I did. So I read his poem, and the big topic that I addressed there, which I want to address as well, is this word loneliness is a very it's a word that people don't like to talk about a lot. But at the end of the day, some even wonder whether we aren't all lonely people, just covering up with all kinds of layers of parties and distractions that keep us busy. Because at the end of the day, we all walk home alone. And even if we have loved ones and we have people who care about us, there are things in our core personality that you never really share. There are things that we don't want to share. There are things we don't even know how to share. And at the end of the day, is there anyone there for you besides yourself? It's a big question. People are there for you when they need you. People are there for you when they value you in some way. But what about when you're in that place where nobody has some particular need, and there's no money involved, and there's no other ulterior motives? And it's a big question, which is what we call existential loneliness. And sometimes you can just burst out in tears for no apparent reason, because there's a type of element, this existence itself is a lonely place. And I'm not taking away from the beauty, many beautiful things in life, and we all have, I'm sure, some beautiful experiences. But there's that part of us that has that element. Some people, just simply what they do to avoid it is just, as I said, they fill up their time with so much activity, there's no time to think about it. Which doesn't necessarily mean it solves anything, it just means that it's like glossing over or distracting ourselves. So this is a topic which actually is addressed very much in this week's chapter. A whole verse dedicated to it. So there's a verse that goes right in the beginning of the chapter. It talks about Jacob coming back to Israel after 20 years, living with his uncle, the corrupt and shrewd Laban. So now he comes back to meet his twin brother, Esau. So it's going from the frying pan into the fire. Esau was another character. And they didn't get along, brothers. So finally they're about to confront each other. But before they do, Jacob has elaborate ways to protect his family. He prepares for war, because maybe his brother will go to war with him. He prays, and he prepares also a bribe to appease his brother. But then it says after he takes his family and crosses over the river, Jacob goes back, and it says the expression is Vayivasar Yaakov Levade, that Jacob remained alone. And here's the classic story that you may know, the classic story of Jacob wrestling with the angel all night long. Wrestling with the angel. It's one of the classic biblical stories. But the story, the words before the wrestle begins is that Jacob remained alone. Jacob remained alone. Yeah. And there are many commentaries that discuss what the significance of this loan is. And it's interesting because if you go through the Torah and the Bible, you find the word alone is used in different contexts, sometimes as a virtue, sometimes as a negative. I mentioned Tisha B'Av, the Saturday day in the Jewish calendar. So Tisha B'Av, the prayer we say the night of Tisha B'Av, which is in the summer time, the 9th of Av, usually around in August. So we begin the book of Lamentations. Lamentations is the sad episode, the sad narrative of what happened when the temple was destroyed. And it says there that Eicha Yashva Badad, that's the words. Woe. That's how it begins. Eicha in Hebrew, woe. Or how sad it is that she sits alone. This is Jeremiah the prophet bemoaning the destruction that he witnessed. Woe that she sits alone. That's how he begins. Badad in Hebrew is alone. And he's referring to the city of Jerusalem, actually, not even people. He's referring to woe that the city sits alone and desolate after its destruction by the Babylonians, which then later would take place 490 years later by the Romans, the Second Temple. In Jerusalem that we know today, the Western Wall is the remnant that remains from the original glorious temple that was once stood there. 2 temples that stood there. And then that's in a negative sense, the loneliness of the city. And then there's a positive sense later in the Bible you find when Moses and also when Balaam the prophet compliments the Jews as a virtue. They also says Am Levad Yishkan. This is a nation that sits apart, that sits alone. Which in a sentence, in one word, captures very much what the Jewish people have gone through history. Tomorrow there's going to be a vote in the UN. Pretty much know what happens in the General Assembly when there are votes around Israel. Basically to isolate Israel yet again. And people were concerned this isolation, the world versus Israel. Western world. Yes, the United States is an ally, but Jews especially are always wary because we saw what happened 60 years ago. Suddenly very good people could turn either silent or complicit in a genocide. So this isn't the first time. Throughout history, you can say the Jews have remained in some way apart and alone. Some people blame the Jews for that. Anti-Semites like to blame the Jews. You made yourself apart and alone. Haman, just like Hitler, similar name, they both stated the same thing. They said, here's this nation. You read Mein Kampf, and you read, I'm not recommending the book, I'm just saying if you've read it. And you read Hitler's statement in the Megillah, Esther, they say the same thing. Here's this nation, they're all over. That's what he tells Achashverosh. Here, this one nation spread and across your entire kingdom, all the 127 nations that you control. He's telling Achashverosh, who was the king of Persia, which was then the time the superpower. Of Deseim Shenis Makolam, and their faith, their customs, their behavior is different than all nations. It's exactly what Mein Kampf, he says. Hitler says, I saw these creatures walking in the streets of Vienna, and they're like mingled, they're everywhere, but they're not us. All this is the classic anti-Semitic opening statement, the usual cases. That's how you begin. That they're here, but they're not us. Basically, they're feeding off of us, but they're not us. Strangers. This type of being apart and alone. So is this a quality? Is it a virtue? Is it a vice? As I said, even in the Bible, sometimes used as a negative. Sitting alone is not very positive, lonely. But then there's Am Levad Yishkan, which is seen as a virtue, a compliment that you know. Alone. So let's define what alone means. Alone can be a great virtue. Anyone that's unique is alone. That's what means uniqueness, right? If you weren't unique, you wouldn't be alone in your uniqueness. So basically, anything original really has a certain element of loneliness to it. It doesn't necessarily mean a negative loneliness, but it means that what you have, someone else may not relate to or understand. Basically, almost every pioneer, I don't say almost every pioneer, all began alone until it became popular. And then everybody's on the bandwagon. But you tell me, show me someone that made a breakthrough that everybody just said, oh wow, that's great. It never works that way, or else it wouldn't be a breakthrough. And this, whether you're talking about Einstein or the Wright brothers, or anyone that had any innovation. It's very frightening when you come up with a new idea, and because people say, who do you think you are? You're going to suddenly change an attitude. And then you start wondering, well, it's true, maybe do I have something that no one else has? But it's interesting, the whole basis of life, as I began this class tonight, is that each of us is unique. Each of us has the dignity of being unique. And uniqueness comes with a certain element of loneliness. It's not lonely if you're confident in it and you feel strong about it. And not only is it not lonely, you can actually persuade others to come along. So you become a leader. But leadership itself is lonely because not everybody wants to lead. And everybody wants to be told that they're not leaders. So what do you do about that? You know? So it's itself its own paradox. But the fact of the matter is each of us has an element that's absolutely unique. And it wouldn't be so sad if you were able to be appreciated for it, obviously. But there's nothing wrong with being unique, and there's nothing wrong with, in a certain way, not having others fully appreciate or understand exactly what your uniqueness is. And this is the essence of Jewish thought, that God created each of us differently. Not one of us is similar to another. We have many common denominators. We have many things we share mutual, but there is something about each one of us that is absolutely unique, and thus has an element of a certain lonely aspect to it. But how we compensate for this loneliness is by realizing that there's other unique people around us, and if we join together, you're lonely and I'm lonely, my unique and your unique, together we can create something that's far more powerful. Think of it like different musical notes, the analogy I often give here. Each note is unique in its own way. So if you enter the psyche of that musical note, it's a very lonely note because the note near it has a different sound. But they join together and they play music together. So the fact that we're unique and in a sense alone in that way doesn't necessarily mean that we're bound to some type of sad or despondent life. It simply means you have to know how to appreciate uniqueness and see it for its qualities, not necessarily for its negatives. What I would submit, the negative loneliness is not about uniqueness, it's really about our own sense of security and fears. Sometimes even insecurities and fears around our own uniqueness. Which really means that when Jeremiah was lamenting the fact that she sits alone, there he was talking about a demoralization that's a result of that. When you feel demoralized, you feel alone, you feel weak, you feel no one else is there, that's a whole other story. So the truth is, the real objective is not to cease being unique, because, if I look like everybody else, and if I compromise my individuality, and everybody will love me because I'm doing what they do. Many people capitulate that way. What you're doing then is basically destroying yourself in order to be liked. It's called a pleaser. We've heard this profile as well. People are pleasers because it's the easy way. That way I don't have to stand out. Because the other option is, if I'm not going to compromise myself, then I will be misunderstood. I'll be too unique, etc., etc. So there's a third option. The third option is to recognize that your uniqueness is something divine. It's a gift. It's a gift, and as a gift, you should be fully confident and fully appreciative and proud of it. And find people who appreciate you for your uniqueness. And if you're hanging around people who don't, who are demanding subtly or overtly that you conform, then they're not really your friends. You need to find people who will appreciate and validate that unique element. So here we go back to the story of Jacob. Both on an individual level, Jacob individually was left alone, and in many ways, as I said, the Jewish people often feel quite alone. Yet, at the same time, this lonely people, this nation alone, actually brought civilization to the world. So I don't care what the anti-Semitic Christians or Muslims may say, but without us, they wouldn't be here. So that's the bottom line. I'm not trying to pull rank, but that's reality. Meaning that the principles that were given at Sinai to the Jewish people, a small nation, and remain a minority, are principles that, with persistence, ultimately change the world. So just like Einstein in his way, and just like any other pioneer in his way, Judaism was a pioneering force that changed the world for the better. And we paid heavy price for that. We've been killed for it. There's been vengeance, jealousy, however you want to describe it. But Jews never went down just because. When Mordechai and everyone else around Haman was bowing to him and worshiping him because he was now the guy in power, the guy comes to power, everybody now is worshiping him. Mordechai was the only one that refused to bow. He maintained his individuality and refused to bow, and almost paid a very heavy price, because that's what incited Haman to convince the king to annihilate all the Jews. Now that didn't happen. Haman got annihilated, but what incited him was this insistence that Mordechai did not want to be conform. Could not stand his lack of conformity. Everyone is worshipping me, why are you not worshipping me? So we go back now. The first time loneliness is mentioned here is in this story, Vayavik Yishemai, where Jacob remained alone. I want to talk a little about this existential loneliness. So let's talk a little mystical language here. I've often described, and some of you may be familiar with, a Lurianic concept in Kabbalah called the Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum, in simple English, means a concealment. But it's not just a concealment, it's called a radical concealment. Tzimtzum is used as a word of thinking of it in the terms using these are words from the Eitz Chaim, these are words from the Book of Life, which is the Arizal, the Isaac Luria, one of maybe the greatest Kabbalist of them all, lived in Tzfat in the 16th century. So he writes in cryptic terms. He writes that the beginning, which is not beginning in time, but conceptual beginning of all of existence, he writes that the divine infinite light, what's called the Or Ein Sof, the infinite divine light, filled all of existence. Now there was no existence as we know it, but it means filled whatever would become existence. That's what dominated. A type of, let's call it unifying energy, called divine energy, whatever you want to define it. And then it says, in this all-encompassing and omnipotent energy, there was a tzimtzum that essentially concealed or contracted or concentrated the energy, the light. And then emerged a ray, a thin ray, kavachut, a thin ray or a thin line and flow of energy. That's what he says. And that's where existence begins to emerge as we know it. And then there's a whole process, how essentially almost like a description think of the description from the moment of conception to the moment where a child emerges from its mother's womb. So there's a big bang, fertilization of an egg, and then it begins to multiply. A cell separates more cells, and something that we couldn't even imagine suddenly begins to shape into a child, into a fetus that will one day be a child. And here we are, sitting in chairs with full complex lives, small little human beings, 5-6 feet tall, over 100, 150 pounds, and with all the complexities that we carry. And it all began in a seed that never imaginable that it could turn into such a complicated life. So in a way, when you read it in Kabbalah, it speaks in obviously metaphorical terminology, but that's the idea. That everything first began as a complete, all-encompassing light and energy, and for matter to emerge, that energy had to be concealed, and then slowly, like a thin ray of light, enters to begin to the process of what we call creation, existence. The best example given for this by some of the other mystics that explain this metaphor is, to make it more palatable to relate to, is basically what's the most natural transmission from one person to another is a teacher to a student, where ideas, knowledge is being conveyed. So think of the education process. A child goes to school for the first time, begin to learn ABC. When you learn A, B, C, D, you have no clue, the child has no clue what this A is about, what this B. They're just letters. They don't even know how to combine letters initially. Then, today we know that those letters then, once you know how to write a letter and pronounce it, letters turn into words, words turn into sentences, Sentences turn into phrases, paragraphs, chapters, volumes, knowledge. But it all begins in a very spoon-fed, slow process. So for a teacher that is infinitely beyond a student, that teacher is filled with ideas. That teacher has a multitude of knowledge, both quantitatively and qualitatively, infinitely distant from a beginner student. So what does the teacher do to be effectively communicative? If the teacher just opened his mouth and just shared his knowledge, it would overwhelm. It would probably be destructive even to the process of education. A good communicator, a good teacher, reveals while he conceals, or she conceals. In other words, it's a process of first you have to somewhat conceal all your ideas, all the knowledge, and especially the cumulative spirit of the knowledge that you have, and then allow room for a student to sit there, because it's silent, the light is now, the energy is not there, and now begin a thin ray of transmission, step by step. We'll first learn A, B, C, D, then we'll learn how to build words, then we'll learn ideas, concepts, theories, and slowly that ray of light becomes the channel of transmission from a very profound concept into a child that is still just at early stages. But as the child's containers expand, and these are words used in the Kabbalah, containers, expand, it allows more energy in. As more energy goes, so then the flow through the kav, through this thin lay, becomes broader. And basically the channels broaden and broaden to the point that one day the student can not only reach the same level of intelligence as the light as it was before the tzimtzum, before the concealment, but could even reach beyond. The student can become even greater than his teacher. When he began, he didn't even know what the letter A, Aleph, Beis. So this essentially is used as a metaphor to understand all of existence. This is who we are. Even consciousness itself, the way we appreciate consciousness, we're conscious of something. Consciousness is limited awareness. That's really what consciousness is. If the unconscious of a person's mind were to open up the floodgates, and it would come flowing into our consciousness, we would go mad. In other words, the way intelligence flows into your brain, literally, your mind, it comes first a spark of an idea. That idea is fleshed out into a fully developed concept, until you really turn it into a full-dimensional being. Everything in life is that way. You write a business plan, you write a book, you write a paper, anything. It begins with a concept, a title, a germ of an idea. Then you flesh it out, you create an outline, a framework. And then you fill it in, and finally becomes a full-bodied entity. So any real healthy process in life it works this way. That's how it works. If you jump the gun or you go too quickly to the end, you may miss something. So you have to. That's how you build things. That's how you build them. Healthy education, healthy transmission of knowledge, healthy communication, healthy relationships are all built on this principle. You go too fast, you overwhelm and overflow. You go too slow, you deprive. So it's a dance. It's a dance. A person may have a lot of love inside of them, but they may not know how to give love. They may give love on my terms, but not on the recipient's terms. So you may be, with all good intentions, pouring, and you end up destroying what you love. You end up overwhelming them. You end up... Then some people are very good at discipline. But discipline is a measure that has to be measured with the giving. So it's like giving, concealing, revealing, and so on. This is true good communication. Because we're different entities, and none of us are in the same place, so it's about a give and take, and really learning how to use the gas and the brake, so to speak, in a proper, balanced way. If you were to say an imbalanced life, is basically where one is either dominating or the other. There's too much, or there's too little. It's really the story of everything. All health is based on that. Blood is a very important thing. It has to flow through your body. And if there's blockages, too little, it's running unhealthy. But if blood is flowing too fast, or it's too thin, it's also a problem. So you need to have the perfect balance. And psychologically, emotionally, this is definitely the case. So going back to, our formative child years, it comes down to whether we saw people who are balanced in their lives, and therefore we learned to balance. If we didn't see balance, we have bad role models that distort our standards, our models, our archetypes. one of the reasons we read the Torah is because it's meant to give us an archetype of a balanced human being. So the Torah does never minces words. It will be very blunt and talk about a person's healthy, unhealthy, what he does, what he doesn't do. There's no one in the Torah that comes out unscathed. Everybody comes out as flawed. Because the Torah is very blunt in describing human beings. And it doesn't shy away, like say in this case, Jacob remains alone. So loneliness is a very important factor. Because I remember more than once, quite a number of times, but the first times I heard it, it shook me. When I was a younger man, we were all younger men, once, and younger women. So my models and my so-called framework experiences were what I grew up with myself, my home. No home is perfectly functional, but relatively speaking, it was a pretty functional home. Some things I would never imagined until I started seeing and hearing other people's lives. So to me, my childhood was a very happy childhood. I felt validated. Now I know those words. I felt confident. I had confident parents who conveyed a lot of that confidence and gave it to us as children. They said nothing is perfect, but more or less. When I first heard the first time, I remember someone in Europe, growing up in Europe, a very privileged life, let's put it this way. Had everything she needed, literally everything. Grew up in a palace, basically. But as she put it to me, I grew up in a gilded cage. Yes, it was all made out of gold, but it was a cage. And when I asked her once what to describe it, with one word that captured it all was loneliness. I was a lonely child. I felt alone. My parents were never almost available. They gave me everything. I had nannies. I had music lessons. I had art lessons and dance lessons. Best education. Everything I had. But I was lonely. I felt alone. And, it struck me, what is a child can't even talk about being alone. A child doesn't think in those terms. Because a child doesn't even know what's the opposite if it's not given. But I would say that it's a major factor in most of our lives if we were left alone. One of the most terrifying things for a child is to be left alone at night. Or be left alone when there's no one coming home or something like that. I even had a little experience. This is my most dysfunctional experience I could remember was where me and my sister were standing in the window. And our parents told us that they're coming home soon. It was raining out there and we were just crying in the window waiting for them to come. Don't be so sad. It wasn't such a big thing. They came, I don't know, children have a distorted sense of time. Maybe they came 10 minutes late for all I know. But it sounds to us like 10 years, children. But I remember that, and I see it when I look at my grandchildren, I look at little children, I see their fear of being left alone. And I don't just mean left alone in the dark, it's just a certain element of the need for a child to feel nurtured, feel someone cares. But I wonder, and it's hard even to quantify, what kind of impact, not once, if there's a sustained being left alone. And when I say left alone, I don't mean even physically. You could have your parent there and they're not there either. Another guy told me my mother was always there, but she was always playing cards and never had time for us. So she was always at home, but she was not there. So all these things what end up happening is they wear down a person's individual confidence in that uniqueness, the positive side of being alone, and all you're left with is the negative. That being alone means I'm not worth anybody's attention. I'm not worth that somebody is going to come home to me. I'm not worth it. And that is, as I said, demoralizing. So when you read the story with Jacob, actually, it's a very empowering story if you really think about it. Yes, he remained alone, but you know what happens next? He has a wrestle. He has a war. He has a war with the forces. This is called the angel of Esav. But psychologically, the war was really with his own fears. It's a war. And it's a war that happens at night, actually. Some say this was the night of Yom Kippur this took place. Some say the night of Tisha B'Av, I believe, as well. Different opinions. So at night, he has this war. Think of it like he's confronting his own inner demons. He's confronting his own loneliness. And what happens is the night passes, and he keeps on fighting, and he prevails. He prevails. As the morning rises, as the dawn rises, and as the night passes, the angel says to him, and here again I'm speaking in psychological terms, that voice says to him, I have to move on. You have prevailed over me. But Jacob won't let him go till he blesses him. And then he blesses him and says, your name is Israel, not just Jacob, Israel, which means you have the power to prevail over God and his agents. It means you have the power to prevail, in this case God meaning the powers of these negative forces. That you have the power to prevail over an angel of God. Now, what it means in psychological terms is that he confronted being alone, and he came out stronger, and realizing that if you can embrace your strengths and find confidence to do so, it actually makes you more powerful. It's like when they say, that which doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Had Jacob never went through this episode, had he never been alone, had he never experienced this, he would never have built up this strength and this confidence. So in many ways, what takes place in this few verses here really becomes a source of strength to us all, because it's an example of somebody who's able to face that part of themselves. So each of us have, as I said, these inner, demons, these inner voices, these inner fears, and there's an element of us feeling alone in the weak sense of the word, which means that we don't really fully feel confident. And in many ways, this becomes an issue that affects relationships, because there are parts of ourselves we never want to share with anyone. We say, if someone found out this about me, who knows what they would do? So you have to put on a face and a character, a personality that is more likable, which of course really means that you're not really showing yourself, because you're afraid to. You're afraid of your own. You're afraid of your own ugliness, so to speak. And ultimately, the ultimate solution to all of this is to recognize that we are living in a world which has a major symptom that conceals. The first most lonely, all existential loneliness is rooted from God concealing himself, from the teacher concealing all that energy. But the intention of that was not to conceal in order to weaken us, it was conceal in order for us to emerge as unique individuals. If the teacher would not conceal or hide his brilliance, the student would never be able to emerge. It would be all about the teacher. The true sign of a real leader, of a real mentor, of a real friend, actually, is someone who not only empowers you, but also gives you the confidence to be confident in yourself. To help you help yourself is a far greater achievement than just to help somebody. So you have expressions, for example, in the Torah, you have expression that when you teach, make sure that your student becomes a shalheves elam elah, which means a flame that rises on its own. In the temple, it was a mitzvah for the priest, when he would light a flame, that he shouldn't just wait, she shouldn't just go jump to the next flame, but that he should wait patiently until the flame catches. It takes a split second. It can burn out, it takes a split second to catch. And this becomes a whole discussion, a whole topic. Why is it so important that he wait till it catches on its own? Because it's the core essence of all real love and communication. You're not going to babysit for someone else. You help them stand on their own feet. In relationships, this is a critical aspect. Many people try to heal their problems through finding a mate or a companion or a friend or a soulmate that will give you what you were lacking in your life. Basically, you want them to become your mother or your father, or want them to fill up the thing that you've been deprived of. Now, that's really unfair, obviously, because nobody can really give that to you. You have to give it to yourself. And it's also it's an unnecessary. It's an overwhelming pressure on another person when they discover that's what you're expecting of them. So, a healthy relationship, which is really based on the idea that a person has a certain sense of self. Then you meet someone else who has a certain confident sense of self, and these two people can complement each other. And yes, be their support, and yes, compensate even for things that may be lacking, but not total dependence. Total dependence ends up having to be self-destructive because it's just too much of an imbalance going on. So the idea is essentially that a person has to find a way, each of us has to find a way to connect to that lonely place. The most basic way to do that is to find someone to speak to find someone you can confide in, and not be ashamed, and not to feel judged, and feel someone you can trust. I know that may be a big task, a difficult task, but that is one of the best and healthiest ways to go about it. Is to find some way to find somebody you can speak to, you can trust, and open up a bit. And above all, you're looking for someone who will validate and help you stand on your own feet. That's the key to it all. Because as long as someone else is taking care of you, there's an element of that also undermining your confidence. It means you can't do it yourself. Which is why a good teacher and a good communicator and for that matter, a good love, real love, is when a person not only gives you but also knows how to not give. So you should be able to come to find some of your own answers. The greatest teachers are the ones that teach methodology, not solutions. Solutions, yes, they may give you examples, but they want to teach you the methodology, how to solve problems. Not just a whole list of here's a bunch of 20 solutions to your problems. That whatever will come up, you will have the tools and you'll have the methods to address it all. And these are ultimately the things that help a person get beyond their so-called the demoralizing loneliness to find a healthier form of loneliness. So the bottom line is, my friends, is that every one of us here, every one of you, has something absolutely unique. It'd be a good exercise to try to figure out what that is. Maybe you should try to write it down. I am unique, with a bunch of bullets. See how many things you can come up with. I mean, I know it'd be easy. I'm unique in my anxieties and in my fears and all my insecurities. That's not what I'm talking about. If you want to list that as well. But try to find what you're unique in. And I find whenever I challenge people with that it's quite disarming. It's hard to answer. It's like we all have, hopefully, egos. So we feel we're special, but when you really push to come to someone says, okay, tell me. I know most people don't invite you usually to tell you about all their virtues and qualities, but what are they? And I'm not suggesting you have to tell it to me. Tell it to yourself. Write it down. What makes you unique? You'd be surprised by a few things here. Number one, how few words you're going to find. And it's going to be quite like, I'm not really sure what I'm unique in. Which itself is an interesting testimony. And number two is you may discover that things that you think you're unique may not even be what you're really unique in. Many people write when they're unique is mostly their coping mechanisms. I've tested this. People have tested. I've done this with some people, and they list their coping mechanisms. I'm very good under pressure. I'm very good, which really means that describing the mechanisms they use to function and to survive, which is fine. It's also part of the list, but not necessarily doesn't mean that you're unique. That's what you developed, unique skills to deal with a situation. Like some people, one person I remember once, I asked them to write, and I asked if they want to share it with me, and they did. The number one thing is I'm an escape artist. That's what this guy wrote. I'm an escape artist. Now he meant it not in the circus sense of it, like magic tricks. He has always knows how to find the back door out of any situation. It basically means he's never committed to anything completely. And he's a master at finding ways out. He's got the exit strategy, always figured out. Which really immediately tells you why does he have it so worked out? Because he had to run for his life. He was in very unsafe situations. So, when you start really thinking about it, it forces you to begin to dig and say, okay, what am I unique in? Not as a result of some other issue, but like what makes you unique that's self-generating from within you. What is inherently unique about yourself? And we don't live in a society that people encourage us to ask that question or definitely answer it. But this is, to me, quintessential Torah. This is exactly what the Torah is about. The first verses are all, you're created in the divine image, which means you have a divine aspect to you. So what does that divine image look like? It's the first question one would ask. If you read the Bible, it says, okay, I'm created in the divine image. Hey, what's my divine image look like? What does a divine image altogether look like? Is it like as I often say, someone asks you, who are you? Most people give you their business cards. Business card is what you do, not who you are. And most people's business cards actually are things that really contradict who they are. Most people don't even like what they do. So who you are and what you do there's a big disparity between those two forces. Some people learn to like what they do because they've got no choice, and some people hate what they do. And there are the rare people who actually love what they do, truly love, and it really expresses. But these are big, big questions because they lie at the heart of most of our challenges. If you're spending day after day after day doing something you don't really like doing, so I understand we can cope, we can manage, it doesn't mean the whole world is turning in, but what does it mean to your soul? It means that the real you, the real thing that should give you dignity, that uniqueness, ends up being basically all buried and wasted, and it cannot build your self-confidence that way. You could develop all kinds of mechanisms and tools to function and be extremely successful at it, but the real you, so to speak, your voice has never expressed itself. So it goes into like a slumber, into a dormant state, And it just sits there. But it doesn't just sit. It gnaws at you, and it has to affect you one way or another. Because it's like it's like a part of you that's asking for food, is hungry, and not being fed. And then meanwhile, you're developing a whole bunch of other mechanisms that are not really expressing that part of a person. So obviously, a person like that is going to become quite lonely, because that voice in you becomes lonely. It has no expression. So in a sense, you can say really loneliness is a part of yourself that is dead. Or part of yourself, I wouldn't say dead, is asleep, and has not been expressed for years and years and years. I would suggest, why does music touch us so? And everybody knows music. Suddenly you can be in the worst mood, you can be whatever, you turn on certain music, you lock yourself, it closes, transports you to another time and place. Especially today, all the surrounding music, you feel like you're submerged, and you go somewhere. You go on a trip. Whether it's memories, whether it's escape, whether it's fantasy, it doesn't really matter. But it definitely transports you. What's really happening? As I've discussed many times when I speak about song and music, music touches that part inside of you that is long forgotten. That's why it's so powerful. Because it's able to pierce, so-called your business card, and your outer layers, and is able to access a part of you that has long been lost. And the problem is that it doesn't last. The music ends, the music dies, that's it. What happens next? You're back to square one. You're back to reality, so-called, quote unquote. But music is absolutely a tool, and it could be used as a real tool, because if you're able to access that place inside of you, imagine now if you're able to act on it, some way actualize it. Which is why I always suggest, and I suggest it right now as well, that one of the ways to find that healthy, lonely, unique place in you is actually to, once you discover or identify something that's unique, maybe you should begin doing something that actualizes it. Like some people say, I always loved to draw, but I haven't done it in 20 years. I have no time for it. Don't think it's just a hobby. Maybe it is a very important voice inside of you that needs to be expressed, and maybe you have to find a way to express it, just like exercise. Some people have that feeling about dancing, some about music, some arts, and sometimes it's other matters. We all have something that is lying dormant inside of us. That's not even a question. And the question how powerful it is and how important it is, that can be measured. But accessing that is the first way to build self-esteem. You build self-esteem not by superficially imposing it. You try to find the thing that uniquely you are good at, or not necessarily good at, but are unique in, and figure out ways to cultivate it. Now, the best scenario would have been if someone did that to us as children, and not just didn't abandon and neglect or invalidate, but actually helped identify our little strengths as we were little kids, and helped cultivate it, and helped encourage, and helped bring it to the surface. Because then you come into the adult life well armed with confidence, with a self-awareness. Here's things I'm good at. I know I can take on a challenge. These things are extremely important. I know I can run the marathon and maybe win. That type of confidence that comes in self-awareness and awareness of your own strengths is, of course, the key to all self-esteem. But even if we have been deprived in some way, or somewhat has been aborted, or in some way stunted, that doesn't mean it's all over, because you're alive and kicking right now. That's what my assumption is, based on empirical observation. And as a result, you have in you these forces. I feel blessed. Someone once asked me, I remember it was I feel blessed to be part of your journey, and I hope you feel blessed to be part of my journey. That we can all help unstuff some of these blockages. I was going to share the following story. I remember it was a while back. I think I've told the story here. So there was a couple coming to this class. They were dating for years, and the woman had already said, time has come for the fruits to fall off the tree. Let's get married. Anyway, he for some reason was resisting. No way. Okay. So she asked me, and she asked him, would he come speak with me privately? Let's figure out what's going on. So we met. I remember in Brooklyn at the Grand Army Plaza Library upstairs there. And a very sweet guy, brilliant guy, and we started talking back and forth. And of course, I went through all what they call the usual suspects. His parents had a difficult relationship. He has commitment issues. There's a whole grocery list of suspects. And we went through that, and nothing checked out, meaning everything seemed pretty healthy in his background. And then I don't know what it was, suddenly something struck me, like intuitively. I said to him, I think you have commitment issues, not just with relationships, in every area of your life. That's my guess. Is there anything in your life, that was what I asked him, anything that you're ready to die for? And I don't mean literally die for, anything that you're so passionate that it's unconditional, it's not non-compromising, unwavering. And he looked at me, he said to me, no, I don't think so. I built a life to make sure I don't have anything like that. So, and then he challenged me in return, which was fair. He said to me, and what about you? What do you have that's like, what's your calling, so to speak, that you're unwavering, that unconditional type of commitment, no matter what you're in? And I just answered spontaneously. I didn't even think of it. For some reason, it shook a memory in my mind, shook up something that I hadn't thought about in years. And I said to him, when I was a little kid, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years old. So I lived on a place called Sullivan Place, and the school we went to was 20 blocks away. So either we had a school bus, which I always missed anyway, so that didn't work. So it was a city bus, or sometimes you walk. You could walk as well. I'd take a bicycle sometimes. But for some strange reason, especially when it rained, I liked to walk. I used to walk the 20 blocks. And I had this quirk. I shared this with him. I mean, this is one of these little quirks, these lonely little quirks that you never talk about. Everybody's got their stupid quirks. So I had this quirk that I would walk when it was raining, on the streets in New York. So the water runs down the curb into the sewers in the corner, right? And I would have this mishagas, that I would go and, it was sometimes twigs, or dirt, or a piece of paper, or something, or leaves, blocking the flow, and I would create a little path. I like to create these paths that the water should, be able to flow a little smoother into the sewer, as if it made any difference. But that was my thing. Now that I'm thinking about it, also many kids like these little railroad trains. They just like paths, and I guess paths, open up channels and paths. And I said to this fellow, now we're talking, I'm no longer 6, 7 years old, at least not chronologically, but my inner child still likes the same things. I said, my passion that's unconditional. I see it in my life time and again. I am absolutely committed to helping people open up channels. Just like I did then as a kid, then it was with water and whatever. It became symbolic for me. I have this deep pleasure when I meet somebody, and if they come for advice or in any other way, to help maybe unblock something that can let something flow through, and they can see something differently they didn't see before, or recognize their own strengths and stuff like that. And it was interesting, his reaction. He began to cry. He said, wow, that's so moving. I wish I had something like that. Anyway, long story short, this man is married to this woman, they have children and stuff like that. It didn't happen right away. It wasn't because I said this and suddenly some magic. But I guess it planted a seed in his mind. And then he worked it out, it wasn't really, his fears were not for any big reasons. It's just comfort. It ended up being his comfort zone, that he just didn't commit to things. So that's a good ending. That's one of the happy ending stories. I usually avoid telling the not happy ending stories, people don't like movies that don't have happy endings. But going back to our discussion here, I firmly believe that each of us has these unique and indispensable and powers and forces. Unfortunately, most of us have not been validated to discover them, and even if we know some of them, we don't really have the validation to act on them. And then life takes over. You got to pay your bills, and we got all kinds of other stuff that overwhelms us. And how much time is there really for that voice inside? But that is the root of all our issues. And though it's sometimes hard to go there, we just like to have a magic pill or press some buttons that say, solve my problem. But when it comes to relationships, particularly love, I mentioned sexuality, any of this real stuff that's inside, there's no way around that. Yes, to maybe buy a loaf of bread or buy a book, you can just press a button online, pay, and you get it delivered. But when it comes to emotional relationships, it comes to the real things in life, like I say, the search for truth, the search for integrity, for happiness, for love, for God, for spirituality. All these things are all connected to finding that voice inside of us. So it comes down to how important is it to you. And if it's a priority, you're going to do something about it. And if it's not, or you choose to push it off, which itself tells you that it's not, then your results will be proportionate to your investment, basically. I'm not saying this in any, God forbid, threatening way. I'm not the judge. We're all in the same boat. But I feel blessed because I feel that I grew up and was taught and learned things information that helps unblock these channels. But I don't think it's my wisdom or my intelligence. I think it's about us sharing, because each of us has something absolutely unique. And the only way for me to be my unique self is for me to help you to be your unique self. And for you to be unique is help myself and help everyone else. That's how it works. Because these things tend to become contagious. You project what you are. When you are a person that is, if you're looking for integrity in your life, you need to deliver integrity. That's not a one-way street. You can't expect people to have integrity to you if you don't have integrity to them. These things tend to become like mirror-like images. And it doesn't matter how manipulative or smart you may be. The real things in life, just like love. Love, words from the heart enter the heart. Words that come out of the mouth or the brain enter one ear and go out the other. The book of Proverbs says it this way: Kamayim aponim leponim, as a face is reflected in water, so too is one heart reflected in another. When you hear integrity, you know it's there. And when you're not sure, or you don't hear it, you know it's not. And obviously there are good manipulators and con artists, but as Abraham Lincoln said, you can't fool everybody all the time. There's especially in moments, and especially many of us who've been hurt, have a certain antennae, a certain sensitivity, where you're more sensitive to certain things that are resonating or not. We live in a world where everybody wants something from us. People are trying to sell us something. They have agendas. Not always bad intentions, but sometimes it's very greedy and selfish intentions. So the challenge, of course, is how to find those few friends, those few individuals that can help us navigate to discovering that inner part of ourselves. So, after all is said and done, loneliness is a reality. It essentially begins, existential loneliness is born in the big tzimtzum. As soon as the divine, all-encompassing energy decided to be silent and decided to conceal itself, there you got the first big loneliness. So you can blame it all on the tzimtzum if you like. After that, it's up to us, which means we too are essentially a microcosm of this type of tzimtzum. We emerge as independent entities and feel disconnected from everything around us. But that's just a concealment waiting to be revealed. In truth is, especially when you're familiar with quantum mechanics today and fields of energy, we are living in a world that is really all one seamless unity. But it appears like fragments because it's like an invisible quilt and with a lot of pieces on it, and the pieces don't seem connected. The truth is they're absolutely connected. And it's all about our perception and our awareness, what we project. When you sense that unity within yourself, within others, it helps bring it to the surface. When you live a fragmented life, so fragmentation breeds fragmentation. And the same thing is with all these voices within us that I was discussing, being actualized or not actualized. It's all about learning to have that confidence within yourself. But as adults, the most powerful way to recreate something that we may not have had when we were younger is to find the right people around us that believe in us in that way. And it doesn't have to be a lot of people. One good friend, one good mentor that has that type of confidence themselves can change your life. Because you see a living example of someone that can live in a fearful world, in a world that's full of unknowns and uncertainties, and still maintain equilibrium, and is not impacted by the vicissitudes and ups and downs of the marketplace and all the other forces that are constantly changing. These are people you want to be nearby. You want to stand near people who have courage. You want to stand near people who have the experience to take on a challenge, and in an almost fearless fashion. This teaches us tremendous stuff. And it teaches us above all our own strengths. It's not about just following someone else. As I said before, it's about empowering each other in a way that we learn to have the power on earth to rise on our own. A flame that rises on its own. So in this one little verse here about Jacob being alone and then his wrestling, which is a battle. It captures essentially the battles and the wrestling that we all go through in our lives. It captures the loneliness, but it also captures the ability to overcome anything. So here we are, almost 3,800 years later, from that fateful evening, that lonely night when Jacob wrestled and was alone. And it was documented. And we're here to stand and talk about our great-grandfather Jacob that lived back then, and he built a family and a nation. And look, despite all odds, we're here to talk about that. That to me is unbelievable. What better lesson in courage and in perseverance and in prevailing is seeing a human being who had children and grandchildren that they continue to forge ahead and are here standing now in the 21st century and are able to talk about it. I mean, I don't know if there's a better lesson in success than that. Are we wounded and we have our challenges and we're limping? Yes, Jacob also limped. The Ramban, Nachmanides, is right that when at the end of the story, when the wrestling angel finally left him and blessed him, he left him, however, with one wound. He displaced his hip. So Jacob limped. And he says, the Ramban says, this was the displacement, this was the wound that all of us would experience. All the great souls, tzaddikim, all the suffering that we would endure throughout history. Which means every time we ourselves abused or in some way limp, it's a expression and a result of Jacob's original limp. But limping, but he still came, but was still here. There are people who limped and fell and never rose. Here is a limping man. He limped his way through, but he got to the end of the finish line. So we're here today standing marathon. It's our turn now to carry the baton. Each generation has its leg of the journey, the leg of the marathon we have to run. And we have empowered by strength of people who, as we stand midgets on shoulders of giants, we're able to have their power and accumulate into and channel into ourselves and make us far stronger than we are alone. So we're never really alone in that sense, because you carry in you the genes of your parents and your grandparents and great-grandparents and so on. So even though, yes, some people say, I'd rather not have the genes of my parents because they're too dysfunctional or whatever, but you also have the genes of thank God that they also had parents, and their parents had parents, and somewhere it was healthy. It didn't begin screwed up. That happened in the midway. So we all have within us great powers, and it's about learning to access them, learning to be around people that help us access them. So, we'll all leave here this evening, and everyone will go back to their existential lonely place. I hope that doesn't make anyone cry. But remember that is really a springboard for you to think about what makes you unique. So next time you're alone and feel alone, why don't you just turn that thought into, okay, what makes me different? What's unique? Now, of course, many people say, okay, that translates into how misunderstood am I? That's a big one also. Many people feel misunderstood. And that goes with its close cousin called underappreciated. Now, if you start dwelling on all of that, it's usually going to end up with negative feelings. So I would focus on the uniqueness and don't go into misunderstood or underappreciated element, which is easy to then have self-pity and justifications for all kinds of stuff. To focus on the uniqueness and as an adult say to yourself, okay, what can I finally do? What can I finally do to help actualize this voice? Who can I speak to? And guaranteed, you commit to that and you persist, you'll find your answers. The student is ready, the teacher arrives. That's how it is. The channels are, the energies are there. We need to create the channels. It's like creating containers. Without the containers, the blessings cannot manifest. So we all love to be blessed, and everyone should be blessed. But the greatest blessing is an expression called V'hu yachal kalecha, which means not only are you blessed, not only do I bless you, but I also bless you that you should have the containers, which means your efforts, even small efforts, to contain the blessings. So when you ask for blessings, always say, give me the blessings, but also give me the containers to appreciate them, to hold on to them, and to store them. Because a blessing can come just like the rain can fall, but if you don't have the baskets, if you don't have the buckets, you won't capture it. It'll just fall out to the side. So many blessings are being showered on us all the time. The challenge is to recognize them and to create the right absorbing containers. Which means, number one, to be in a state of absorption, to be ready to receive. And number two, to know how to hold on to it and to appreciate it in that sense. So they have my blessings and also the blessings for the containers, which really means the methodologies that you should be able to rise on your own. And we can all depend and turn to each other for obviously support and the ability to complement each other, as I mentioned, with the musical notes. And that God should bless everyone to finally find that voice, the music inside of you. As opposed to what Thoreau wrote, that most men lead lives of quiet desperation and they die with their song still inside them, that we should live to see and to express the song inside of us, the song, the unique song, the indispensable song, the music that only you and only you can play. So thank you everyone for this, and as I said, it's an honor to intersect in the journey to all of us. I want to dedicate this class to the Refuah Shlema of Mark, our good friend's father, who we dedicated also last week's email to. The Hebrew name is it slipped my name, but do you know the name? Huh? No, I know, but I want to say his name in Hebrew name. If you could look at last week's email, he'll tell me what the name is. I'll mention it. Meanwhile, I'll also say that we will be on next Wednesday. Philip is giving his class tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock, so anyone wants to have more information, just speak to Vovel here. And again, I can help you, Meaningful Life Center can. This is what we're about, opening up your channels. And if you have not left us your email address, please do so. And again, I want to dedicate the class again to Mark's father. You'll find the name. We have the name. Okay. But the intention is there. So you should have a complete refuah shlema, and everyone should be blessed in the fullest possible way, and everyone should have a great week. So until next week, thank you. Okay, Nachum Chaim ben Sarah Golda. Nachum Chaim ben Sarah Golda, refuah shlema, complete refuah shlema, dedicated this class. Thank you again.